Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Pat McCormick, President of City Club, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who are joining us here today in the Governor Hotel, and those of you who are listening on OPB radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today, Professor Nancy Folbre will discuss localism in the age of globalism. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media sponsors ensures that we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and our Friday Forum spring corporate sponsors, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe Williamson & Wyatt. We're grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Join us next week for the State of the Region with Metro President Tom Hughes. Please note that we will not have a forum on May 25th, the Friday before Memorial Day, but remember to purchase your tickets for a discussion on PERS on May 31st. And join us on Wednesday, May 15th for a free event with Lois Levine, educator and author of The Secrets of Mary Bowser, a book based on a true story of a woman born into slavery, freed, and educated in the North, who returned to the South and became a Union spy in the Confederate White House. Tickets are now on sale for our upcoming Civic Salon series, where we will discuss the future of sports, student achievement, books, and food with provocateurs who know all about these subjects. You can learn more about City Club events and purchase tickets on our website, pdxcityclub.org. We will be having a question and answer session with Professor Nancy Folbre at the end of today's program. Today, Portland State University students and members of the club are able to come to the microphone to ask your question. For all of our audience members, please locate the index cards that are on the center of your table and write your questions on them during the forum. We will collect them prior to the start of the question and answer period. And now the program. City Club is pleased to partner with Portland State University and the Vader Memorial Lecture to bring Nancy Folbre, Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, to today's Friday Forum. Mary King, Professor of Economics at Portland State University, contacted us about this opportunity. Mary specializes in labor economics with a strong interest in policy issues. After studying at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, she earned her PhD in economics at UC Berkeley in 1991. You may remember her from her recent appearance at one of our forums as one involved on the student debt crisis, where Mary and two PSU students discussed Pay It Forward, a bold new method to finance public higher education in Oregon. Please help me welcome Mary King, who will tell us more about the Vader Memorial Lecture and introduce Professor Nancy Folbre. Mary?
Thanks a lot. It's really exciting to be partnering with the City Club to present the PSU Econ Department's biggest event of the year, our 6th annual Harold Goodhue Vader Memorial Lecture. And I know that I speak for all of us at PSU in thanking the conveners and members of the City Club's Venerable Friday Forum for bending the rules today to allow non-members who are PSU students to join those asking questions at the conclusion of the presentation. And I'd like to thank as well the generous donors to the Vader Lecture Series for their essential assistance in making this possible. The purpose of the PSU Econ Department's Vader Lecture Series is to remember our dear colleague Harold Vader and to carry on his legacy by bringing an eminent economist to speak to the PSU and larger Portland community on a topic of critical policy significance and wide interest. Harold was a strong scholar with a deep and abiding commitment to social progress, as is our speaker today. Nancy Folbre is Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She's the winner of a MacArthur Genius Award. She's a weekly contributor to the New York Times Economics blog, which is a very high-level online forum by top economists. and she's the preeminent scholar in the economics of caring labor, which is paid and unpaid care work in the family and workplace. Researchers striving to incorporate the full value of unpaid work into our economic measures and thinking are working in close partnership with those focused on incorporating environmental issues into our economic analyses and decisions. Nancy was a co-author of the Sarkozy Commission report led by Nobel Prize winners Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen and Jean-Paul Fitoussi. This report encouraged the replacement of GDP with a measure better designed to capture human well-being and environmental sustainability. Nancy has authored a long list of influential books and articles, which I cannot tell you about without unforgivably stealing time from her presentation, but I'll just tell you that she's done quite a bit of investigation into the question she's addressing today, the viability of localism as an economic strategy in the age of globalism.
Thank you so much. It's a really great honor to be here, and especially to speak on the topic of localism. I think Portland is a city that is widely recognized for its high level of civic commitment and its high level of community activism. I probably can't tell you much that is new about localist commitments, but I'll hope to put those commitments into a larger economic context that I hope will prove useful. As Mary King mentioned, my research background is really in looking at unpaid work within the family, especially the care of children, the sick, the disabled, and the elderly. This work is often assumed kind of unimportant because it's unpriced and unpaid. Sometimes it's treated as a burden rather than as a contribution. Yet we depend very heavily on this work, not just because it's intrinsically important and speaks to our moral values, but also as a really significant input into our global market economy. In general, unpaid work, economic transfers, and unpriced resources are really central to the development and maintenance of human capital. They're really essential to the development of a sense of reciprocity, cooperation, and trust, which is sometimes termed social capital. And they're also really central to environmental resilience and environmental sustainability. In my experience, a lot of community activists are not fond of the term cost-benefit analysis. They feel that it's often used against them. They often hear that what they want is too expensive, that it's unrealistic, that it's utopian, that we can't afford it, that it will reduce economic growth. And partly as a result, I try to take a different tack and suggest a different kind of cost-benefit analysis, one that more broadly takes into account the costs and benefits of unpriced inputs and unpaid work. So here's the bottom line. If you want to develop a sustainable capitalist economy, you can't just focus on financial capital. You have to also invest in human capital, in social capital, and in environmental capital, even when these don't offer a high private rate of return. And I think this perspective, this insistence on a broader concept of capital, provides a way of linking the localist initiative to kind of a broader sense of, broader strategy for community economic development. So what I hope to do today is, first I want to start out by just defining what I mean by localism and go over what I see as some really important localist initiatives. Then I want to explain why I think these initiatives can't be just be categorized as kind of feel-good things that are just kind of have some sweet, lovey-dovey, fuzzy consequences for where we live, but as strategies that are really vital to sustainable economic growth and success. And I also want to alert you to what I see as some real challenges and problems. I don't think localism is an easy strategy. I don't think that we can automatically presume it will be successful. I think we need to be really alert to what kinds of problems localist efforts face. Third, I really want to emphasize the progressive role of small business and tell you what I think about what I think are some very surprising trends within the small business community that suggest that it's developing a rather different political identity from big business, one that has some very direct consequences for state economic development policies, including those in the state of Oregon. And I'll conclude with just a few comments about broader policy issues, especially the issues that I think are really important to try to make localism succeed in an age of globalism. Okay, localist initiatives. I'm going to kind of start with what I think are the most familiar localist tools, and then move on to some that I think might be less familiar. Really, localism as a term kind of originated from emphasis on buy local campaigns, efforts to support local farms and local businesses and strengthen a local economy through encouraging consumers to develop a preference for and a commitment to shopping at local businesses, either through just public awareness and kind of consciousness raising, or through more specific efforts like developing a local currency. And there is now in Portland a Bridgetown Bucks policy that's modeled to some extent after a local currency effort in Western Massachusetts, the so-called Berkshire's currency. Just kind of a way to encourage people to seek to employ the discounts that are available at local stores who are willing to allow transactions in this local currency. There's also kind of a digital version of a buy local campaign here in Portland called Supportland that is a digital means of allowing merchants to give discounts to customers who are willing to shop within the local network. You don't need these, you don't absolutely need these devices to encourage buying local, but I think they help, and they provide kind of reinforcement and publicity for larger buy local campaigns. There are also really important efforts to develop sectoral linkages, so not just consumers, but try to get the whole retail, wholesale, and even manufacturing and farming supply chain involved much more in local networks. So I know there are efforts in this area to promote sustainable local building utilization supply chains so that the linkages with the really important forest products industry can help benefit the local economy. There are also in this kind of portfolio of strategies or zoning or development strategies to either to discourage big box stores or to, at the very least, to moderate the impact of big box stores. This is actually a long-standing movement with a long history in American politics. It started with the anti-chain store movement of the 1920s and 30s. Another dimension is efforts to encourage cooperative institutional forms like consumer co-ops, worker-owned businesses. These have been particularly successful in the area I live, Western Massachusetts, and I'm going to give you a few examples of some very interesting initiatives in my area. There are also some new kind of online efforts to promote sharing of space through organizations like couch surfing, sharing of consumer durables like lawnmowers or snowblowers or bicycles through groups like Neighbor Goods, carpooling. Electronic technology is making sharing technologies more practical, and I think really fostering their expansion in some very positive ways. Also on the localist list are efforts to mobilize local capital and try to invest more money in the local community. Small local banks and credit unions play a really vital role in this process. And finally, there's a larger project of developing the social and physical infrastructure that's necessary to promote local economic development, of which investment in education is clearly plays a really important role. Okay, so these are all feel-good strategies. So what's their economic significance? How do we construct, how do we analyze the potential economic impact of these strategies? Well, I want to sound like an economist here. It's all about incentives. And the incentives are very, very different for local businesses than for larger multinational or multi-state businesses. If you own a business in a local community, you're often working side by side with your employees. You're often sending your children to the same schools. You're walking your dog in the same parks. You benefit from public spending on local infrastructure, you pay local taxes, you depend on the local labor force. This is not true of a lot of forms of equity ownership in large corporations, and often investors who go off in search of the highest return on financial capital are basically ignoring the rate of return on human capital, social capital, and environmental capital in their own communities. And the reason for that is basically incentives. Those forms of capital, the returns on those forms of capital don't appear on their balance sheet. They're hard to measure, they're hard to see, they're hard to estimate. So in the parlance of economics, what local businesses and local cooperatives do is they internalize an externality, and therefore they have the potential to improve overall economic efficiency. A really strong case can be made for both consumer and worker-owned businesses, consumer co-ops and worker-owned businesses in terms of efficiency. Food co-ops are basically organized for the purpose of delivering high-quality food at low prices to consumers. They've traditionally put a great emphasis on the marketing and sale of healthy food, and in many areas of our food economy, incentives are misaligned. Stores and restaurants alike can often reap a higher rate of profit from food that is not particularly healthy, and so they often face a financial incentive to concentrate on the production and sale of those kinds of foods. And consumer co-ops have played a really important role in improving health and nutritional levels and behavior in their communities, as well as providing pretty low-cost, excellent food. Worker-owned businesses, well, John Stuart Mill pointed out long ago in the 19th century that when workers have a share in the profits of the business that they're working for, they have a stronger direct incentive to work harder and to innovate because they will capture a share of the benefits. There's a growing body of literature that suggests that worker-owned businesses are much less vulnerable to the business cycle, that they ride out waves of recession and expansion better than normal firms, because workers have a long-run stake in the firm, and are often willing to help make adjustments. Over the past 4 years, we've learned just how important adaptability to hard times and to recession can be in terms of our own economic welfare. In my own area of Western Massachusetts, I've been really involved with the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops. It's a group of 9 small businesses, all of which have significantly increased their revenues over the past 3 years in a business climate where a lot of other small businesses have not been able to succeed. The same can be said of credit unions. I think we have a new appreciation of credit unions because they rode out the financial crisis much more successfully than bigger banks. Not surprisingly, that's because they had fewer incentives to make the very risky loans that a lot of big banks made. In general, credit unions offer higher rates of return on deposits and lower interest on loans. They are a better deal for many, many consumers. And again, that's because of the incentives that they face. That's why they are set up. That is their purpose, not to seek the highest rate of return on their financial capital, but to think about the larger forms of capital that are important to their communities. And I could tell you many stories about my personal credit union, the UMass 5 College Credit Union, which I think has played a really heroic and interesting role. But you don't have to take my word for it. If you go online and look at consumer ratings of different banking institutions, you will see that credit unions consistently rank much higher for customer service than large banks in particular. A lot of small and community banks, I think, are in there in the running with credit unions, but I think that kind of fits with this larger localist orientation. I'm particularly fascinated by research that shows that communities that have a lot of small businesses seem to be more prosperous communities. They have higher levels of employment. They have lower crime rates. These are benefits that have economic consequences and can be measured in economic terms. I guess, one way to experiment with this is to ask, well, what would happen if you left your wallet at the table here and left? What are the chances that somebody would find that wallet and return it to you? Do you think they're higher in Portland than there would be someplace else? Okay, This is kind of a costly experiment. I'm not encouraging you to actually do the experiment, but there are actually studies that go to look at setup experiments in local cities, in different cities, like a relatively inexpensive experiment is you take a envelope with a check addressed, made out to a local charity that's been stamped but hasn't been sealed, and you leave it on a table, and you see what percentage of those letters actually get picked up by somebody else and just sealed and put in the mail. It's a really interesting quantitative measure. And in general, in small towns, you'll see a higher level of trust and reciprocity measured in that way than in larger towns. And there's some evidence that towns with a greater sense of civic commitment and civic involvement also enjoy that higher level of trust and reciprocity. So, how do we take these? I think the challenge for social scientists like myself is to try to figure out ways to take some of these intangible aspects of economic efficiency and make them more tangible, make them easier to measure, easier to appreciate. But as I mentioned, I don't want to overstate the virtues of localism or make it sound like it's a simple or easy project. There are actually a lot of serious challenges to it. One objection that people often raise is, well, what about economies of scale? It's often cheaper to provide services if you have the benefit of scaling up, enjoying lower unit price. And that's precisely the reason why a lot of us often prefer to shop at large stores that are not always local in nature. And I think this is a very legitimate point, that economies of scale are really significant in some areas of our economy. However, I think it's really important to realize that a price tag is not always the same thing as a price. Sometimes something that appears cheaper in terms of what you pay out of pocket is actually more expensive in terms of long-run consequences for your family and your community. But also, I want to alert you to the fact that we're witnessing some pretty significant technological changes that are reducing some of the costs of decentralized production. And that digital technology that makes it easier for us to share and network and coordinate small enterprises can deliver some really important benefits of scale to local enterprises. And in some ways, excuse me, the digital network that I referred to earlier, Supportland, is an example of that it provides a card with a digital network that enables you to get a discount at a whole panoply of local stores rather than having one different card for every store or trying to keep track of that. I don't know if you followed the emergence of 3D printing, but there's even some possibility that manufacturing technologies are changing in ways that will facilitate greater efficiency in local production and distribution. Also, we already have an institutional form that is very well designed to capture economies of scale and still maintain local autonomy and input. That's called the franchise. We need to develop more creative franchise systems that can combine some of the benefits of economies of scale with local control. Now, cooperatives, both consumer cooperatives and worker-owned businesses, do face a different set of costs, a different set of challenges than other kinds of small businesses. And one constraint is that democratic decision-making takes time and can increase the transactions costs of running a business. One could argue that the same objection applies to our democratic system of government. I don't know about you, but I sometimes think we might actually do better with a king or a queen. I think I'd rather have a queen. But I think democratic decision-making is a really important skill, and I like the idea of encouraging local businesses that foster and develop that skill. I think that alone can pay off in the long run. I also think that skill of democratic decision-making works best in an environment with a high level of social capital and tends to be less functional where there's a high level of inequality. So I think the whole question of developing kind of a healthy and sustainable local economy is one that's connected to the efficiency of democratic decision-making. Finally, we don't want localism to imply economic protectionism or a lack of interest in global trade or the global division of labor. I don't think it's practical to grow bananas in Portland, is it? Or coffee or chocolate. So we don't want to envision a purely local chain, but I think what we could do, again, is make use of the importance of networks and, to some extent, the kind of fair trade and certification efforts that have emerged in the country in the last few years represent a real effort to use global linkages to foster many different localisms that can work together in concert. I think really the most serious problem facing the localist agenda is a shortage of financial capital, a shortage of venture capital, a shortage of investment. And that makes sense because financial capital, by its very nature, seeks a high rate of return on financial capital, not on the other forms of capital that are at stake. So somehow we have to figure out a way to solve this capital bottleneck. And that's what I want to turn to next. I think there's potential to enlist, much more assertively enlist the support of the small business community in developing local initiatives on the national level. And here's why I think this is politically feasible. I think there's a lot of evidence that the business community is increasingly divided between big and small, local and global, and that the global economy itself is driving a wedge between the interests of large global firms and small locally owned businesses. And I think the American public is very well aware of this. It's actually kind of hard to find survey data about attitudes towards business, but a very reliable survey conducted in 2010 by the Pew Research Center found that 71% of Americans believe that small business was a positive influence on the way things are going. That was a lot more than the 25% who believed the same of large corporations. Big difference in political popularity and moral valence. In fact, I think this is kind of embarrassing to people like me. People had a higher opinion of small businesses than universities and colleges, and also than churches and religious organizations. So that says, I think that kind of says something about a set of political loyalties and political constituencies. But let me warn you that there's a lot of disagreement about what a small business is and how it can be defined. And there's generally an effort by big business to define the term in ways that allow them to fit in and ride that popularity wave. The Small Business Administration doesn't have a set criteria for small business. It depends on the particular industry. Because there are some benefits and loans targeted through the Small Business Administration, large firms and large banks often treat small businesses, anything with less than 20 million in revenues or anything with less than 500 employees. If you look at the numbers, most small businesses are much smaller in terms of assets and much smaller in terms of employees. And in fact, most small businesses don't have any employees at all. They are sole proprietorships in which owners are doing all of the work. So let's just be really clear that the firms that are winning the popularity contest are very different from the ones that are defined as being small business. On the other hand, I want to emphasize that size itself isn't the determining factor alone, and that what really matters, I think, is not size, but connections to the local community. I don't know if you followed the discussion about the fate of the Market Fairness Act that is currently under consideration in Congress. This is a really good example of national legislation, really important to the localist agenda, because it would require large internet-based firms like Amazon or also eBay or a gazillion other examples of big online firms to collect sales tax for sales in every state. And if you think about it, there's some small businesses that will be affected by the Market Fairness Act, but in general, it's going to work to the benefit of locally owned and locally run businesses compared to businesses out of state. And I think that is really where the political tensions lie and where they're going to continue to build in the years to come. So There's some really good evidence of, I think, changing political alignments in the small business community. There's a great book by David Hess called Localist Movements in a Global Economy. Talks a lot about differences between the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is still largely dominated by large publicly traded corporations, and smaller groups like the American Independent Business Alliance or the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. There's a terrific recent article in the magazine The Nation by William Greider describing the American Sustainable Business Council, the Main Street Alliance, Small Business Majority. These are all efforts to strengthen progressive coalitions around issues like healthcare and immigration reform. Suddenly, small business is sounding very different on a lot of big issues than it has in the past. And here's where I think an opportunity lies, because I think that the small business community can be mobilized to pursue a policy agenda that is very distinct from the one that most state governments are pursuing. Right now, most of the businesses that are able to garner state economic development incentives in the form of tax breaks and tax abatements are large businesses that have the ability to threaten to leave if those concessions are not delivered. And there's a lot of literature about this, but I think a really good website at the New York Times, which did some investigative reporting on it and has a great website called the United States of Subsidies website, basically estimates that the total cost to taxpayers of economic development subsidies, many of them location subsidies, that is, come to our state and we'll give you a tax break. Don't leave our state. We promise we'll lower your taxes. It's coming to about $80 billion a year. That's a very big chunk of change, and a lot of that money has been picked up by large businesses and very little of it by small ones. So as I'm sure you're aware, here in Oregon, Nike recently won major tax concessions from the legislature, and I understand jobs were at stake, and in a high unemployment economy, most of us are really concerned about unemployment and want to do everything in our power to create jobs. But the question still arises, why would we subsidize one large firm rather than 50 small ones? And basically the reason we do it is that the large firm has the ability to leave, to threaten to leave in the absence of that subsidy. At the very least, I think Oregonians should ask for a close accounting of what the costs and benefits of these tax benefits are. My understanding is that there are some laws on the books that do require public disclosure of how these subsidies are shaking out, but there's a recent report by the Oregon Public Interest Research Group that suggests that a lot of those rules regarding transparency haven't been really fully met and need stronger political pressure. As you probably know, the state of Texas has really been touting its success in luring firms from other states. They particularly like to lure firms from California, and they've probably tried to get some Oregon firms to come down south. There are those who claim that that's been a big part of the Texas economic miracle, but in my view, there's some pretty strong research showing that it hasn't actually paid off very well for the state of Texas, and its overall impact on employment has been relatively small. So meanwhile, there are some alternative economic strategies that are gaining increased traction and increased publicity. You may have heard of the town of Littleton, Colorado. It's a suburb of Denver. It pioneered an approach to economic development that it calls economic gardening, as opposed to economic hunting. Hunting is going out for the big game and then offering the big subsidies to come. Gardening is finding small businesses that are on the verge of expansion and that could have a significant employment impact and trying to nurture and develop them in ways that could help create employment and total output. And the success of economic gardening in Littleton has inspired pilot projects now in several states, including Kansas, Iowa, Louisiana, and Florida. And the Colorado legislature is now considering a statewide pilot project. So economic gardening tends to focus on small companies. And I recently had an honors student, undergraduate at my university, who did a really great paper on this topic and provided a detailed account of the Franklin County Community Development Organization in Greenfield, Massachusetts, not far from where I live. And it's an area where there are a lot of small farms that grow a lot of high-quality organic produce. And what the Community Development Corporation did was establish an industrial kitchen space that met federal standards for commercial food production. And one of their great success stories is the Real Pickles Company. It supplies high-quality, naturally fermented products to about 300 local stores. It's been in business for 11 years, has a current staff of 12. It just announced plans to transition to a fully worker-owned cooperative model. Real Pickles is not Nike. But 50 Real Pickles would have the same employment impact, especially if they could be, of course, they don't have to have, I'm not suggesting they all be pickle companies. We probably couldn't eat that many pickles. But you get the idea of linking them together. There are also a lot of really great examples of efforts to use anchor institutions like hospitals and universities to provide long-term contracts to new locally incubated businesses. The town of Cleveland has been very successful with the Evergreen Cooperatives, helping rebuild the downtown Cleveland. And we have in Western Massachusetts a similar effort underway, the Wellspring Initiative in Springfield, Massachusetts. So states and cities have implemented a lot of strategies like this, but the amount of money that is devoted to them is really small compared to the amount of money that is devoted to these relocation or location subsidies. So I think we need to start asking what we could get if we spent $80 billion promoting small businesses instead of big ones, if we engaged in some more economic gardening and a little bit less economic hunting. Okay, that brings me to a policy agenda, and here I'll try to be short and leave plenty of space and time for questions. First, as I've already indicated, we really need to look at state economic development policies and ask to what extent tax subsidies are going to big businesses that don't have a long-run stake in our communities when they could be going to local businesses that could deliver better long-run gains. We also need to look at national policies. We can't be totally preoccupied with what is local. We need to look at things like the Market Fairness Act, governing sales tax collection. I think another issue that is a really national issue is the cost of swipe fees. Many small businesses are paying fees to credit card companies that far exceed the actual cost of those digital transactions. In Europe, where there's a lot more competition in the banking industry, those swipe fees are much lower, and small businesses have much lower costs as a result. We need to think not just about buying local, but about investing locally. And that means looking at local sources of venture capital and also looking at sources of public capital. Another Oregon example, the controversy over KKR's purchase of the Sealy Mattress Company and moving production to a location out of this state that's a non-union job location, hurting employment in the state of Oregon. It turns out that the Oregon Public Employees Pension Fund has a substantial investment stake in KKR. I just can't think of a better example of an effort to maximize return on financial capital backfiring in terms of lowering the return on the other forms of capital that are more difficult to measure. Another policy issue, I think, is to increase state spending on higher education. I think education is basically the most fundamental incubator of innovation and of local business development. At my own universities, we've developed a certificate program in cooperative enterprises and moved students into internships with local worker-owned businesses. We also have a lot of student-run businesses on campus that have proved very successful and are very well liked and very well loved, and which I think are helping create a whole new generation of entrepreneurs. I would say that Portland State University makes a pretty important contribution to your local economy, and it could do more. It needs your support. It needs your investment. I think Harold Votter would have agreed with that argument. I want to thank him, his legacy, his family, his friends, his community for investing in me, and I hope I made you all feel a little bit richer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Dr. Folbre. And now if you have a written question on an index card, please hold it up high so that City Club staff can collect it from you. Thank you. The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from today's Friday Forum host, Ted Kay. Ted has been a longtime member of the City Club and is currently the chair of the Centennial Committee and serves on the Finance Committee. Ted is also our go-to person for bits of information about City Club trivia. Ted?
Thank you, Pat. Professor Folbre, you mentioned that the annual cost of business development subsidies at $80 billion. Assuming that is United States states and localities competing against each other, is that money simply a waste, a net transfer to business? And therefore, isn't there an argument against such subsidies not doing them at all, as opposed to saying that they should shift to local businesses?
Yes. I think that, in fact, I think it's interesting that this issue of corporate tax subsidies is an issue that crosses the political spectrum, and there are many conservatives who agree with people like myself that they have a distortionary impact and yield very little in the way of genuine net gains, especially on the federal level. On the other hand, as you probably know, Governor Rick Perry and others feel that states should be competing with one another, and maybe that can bring out the best in them. I think they're wrong.
We will now take questions from the floor. Today we invite PSU students as well as City Club members to the microphone to ask your questions. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a PSU student or a City Club member, and please only ask one question and ask your question as succinctly as possible. If I flash this question mark card, it means it's a good time to wrap up your question. Ed?
Edward Hershey, City Club member. Professor, you talked about credit unions providing better service than the big banks. Here in Portland, we have some marvelous examples of other businesses that succeed by being better than chains. Burgerville for one, New Seasons for another. And yet, there is a form of protectionism here and other places, that is campaigns, often involving public officials, against big box stores locating here. I understand the arguments about big box stores and their predatory practices, but in the end, is that a successful argument to promote localism by keeping out the big guys?
That's a great question, and I think it's probably one that can only be answered on a case-by-case basis, community level. But there is a lot of evidence that big box stores have a negative impact on small businesses, on local employment, on the local wage bill. A lot depends on what kind of big businesses they are. But as you know, some very large retail firms pay very low wages. A large percentage of their workers are eligible for food stamps. Essentially, their wages are being subsidized by the taxes that we're all paying to provide public assistance to families that are not earning sufficiently high wages. So I think businesses have a lot of power to play off state governments and local governments for getting the best possible deal. And I think local communities have to kind of play the same game, that is, to negotiate with large firms. And if they do feel like they would make a contribution to the local area, to be sure that they're cutting a good deal and they're bringing in some decent jobs, and that they're willing to make a long-term commitment, and that they fit in with other goals. So I guess I would just urge more better informed and more aggressive negotiation around those issues on the local level.
Hello, thank you for speaking today. My name is Christine McCants. I'm a City Club member and a master's student in the economics department at PSU. I have a strong interest in things that are more difficult to measure because they don't have a profit base. And so kind of your talk about social measures really kind of hits home. But of course, the challenge comes in incorporating those into studies, empirical studies. What kind of measures have you used or would you conceive to try and capture some of these additional benefits that smaller local business can bring so that we can go on and incorporate some of those into the benefits that we're trying to capture?
That's a really great question. There are some measures that I think are pretty straightforward in terms of looking at things like local crime rates, local unemployment rates, small business failure rates in local communities. There's potential to look at social capital in terms of the kinds of experiments I was describing. Why do some cities seem to do better than others in creating an environment in which people and families can prosper? So there's kind of a growing social indicator movement trying to collect data on those issues. As you know, I mean, one model for us all in thinking about this is what's the kinds of tools that environmentalists have developed to look at what your ecological footprint is. That's a really good example of trying to quantify something that previously was not quantified. So you can be looking at what the average amount of energy used by town residents is, or what potential impacts on climate change are, which are very largely determined by local transportation design and innovative kinds of innovative policies that can be used in that area. In my own work on family care, I spend a lot of time using survey data about time use. How much time do people spend taking care of family members? How much time do they spend doing housework? How much time do they spend commuting to work? And there's some really fascinating data out there that allows you to look at a local economy in terms of hours rather than in terms of dollars. And I think that is also a kind of a promising area for examination.
Hi, hello. My name's Allison Arella, and I'm in corporate philanthropy. I was wondering if you could comment on how business support of nonprofit organizations plays a role in localism.
Well, I think that's a great question. A lot depends on which philanthropies and which communities you're talking about. There's been a lot of private foundation support for economic gardening as a strategy, and I think local philanthropies are often engaged in very important forms of local economic development. I think, in fact, they are also a part of the localist agenda. In particular, I think that's true of foundations that are very locally based and have a strong sense of identity and community in place. I really hope that these foundations will be willing to play an even stronger role in the effort to kind of advance the issues that I've talked about.
Gil Johnson, City Club member and local business owner. I have a question about raising capital. It's usually pretty easy, and my experience was primarily in the organic and natural foods businesses, but it's easy. It's not easy, but you start out with borrowing from friends, family, credit cards. Now you can Kickstarter it and all that. You get to a certain point after, if it survives, that the bank will lend you some money after a while based on your assets. But then if you get up to the point where, say, you're like a New Seasons or a Bike Gallery or a Stumptown, you start running out of options other than going to like a stock offering or selling. You go to a stock offering, then all of a sudden you're end up compromising your quality because your primary obligation is now with the shareholders. If you sell out, the new owners come in and they say, no, we're not going to change anything. We'll keep all the people around for, and then about a year later, everybody's gone. So are there any other mechanisms for financing that stage where you become a regional player and, you need to get the capital to stay in competition with the people who are coming in from other places?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that there is a lot of evidence that small businesses do kind of hit a wall there in terms of expansion. And I guess I would like to see, and I guess I imagine that state economic development initiatives could really play a role there in redirecting some capital in that direction. I also want to mention, though, that in Western Massachusetts, we've seen some really interesting, successful small businesses make a transition to a worker-owned business, as happened with Real Pickle. And I think that's kind of an interesting stage to think about in the development of small firms, because by selling out to of course, you need capital for that too. You need to raise the money to actually finance the buyout. But that's a strategy that often ensures that the business will remain really linked to the local community, and I think has some long-run economic benefits. So figuring out ways to help finance and support that particular kind of transition, I think, should be a priority.
Thank you, Professor. I'm Michael Weisdorf. I'm a student in the System Science program at Portland State. You mentioned the importance of human, social, and environmental capital in contrast to traditional notions of financial capital. But we live in an age of financialization. The financial sector has ballooned out of all proportion to the rest of our national economy. So I wanted to ask, what political strategy would you suggest to humanize, socialize, and environmentalize our economy and help restore balance to the financialized situation we find ourselves in?
Let's see. I wish I knew. I don't think there's one magic bullet. I think we kind of need to look for opportunities whenever they present themselves to move in that direction, whether through education or through local economic development or through, I don't know, personal lifestyle decisions to, I just think we pretty much have to do everything and anything we can to try and move in that direction. But, it's either going to happen or it's not. And by that, what I mean is, what I'm talking about is not some great utopian moral vision, this is not some idealistic, it's not some idealistic shtick. What I'm saying is, and I'm willing to bet pretty much my entire life savings and career on this argument, that if we don't solve these problems, we're going to experience a really serious economic disaster. It's very clear on very different fronts. It's clear in terms of climate change. It's clear in terms of increased instability that's associated with financialization. We still haven't really recovered from the recession. I think these persistently high unemployment rates, which are really affecting the younger generation and really destroying kind of the motivation and the skills of the entire younger generation, inability to get jobs, it's very costly. So either we're going to rally around an effort to realign ourselves towards a more efficient economic system, or we're going to pay. And so I think we just have to do everything we can to try to explain that argument.
I'm Greg Schmidt, City Club member. I think all of us enjoy the diversity of small businesses and restaurants and such throughout the Portland area. I think it's part of our quality of life here. I do take issue, however, with one comment you made about 50 Real Pickle stores equating to Nike's impact. That's kind of a silly analogy in my view. But over the last 10 years, we've lost a good number of Fortune 500 companies, huge employers here that provide a lot of family wage jobs that, jobs and incomes that would really be very difficult for small businesses to replicate. So these large businesses do have the ability to make the decision to go somewhere else where maybe they're going to be treated a little bit more fairly. So I think the notion of bad-mouthing larger employers, large companies, relative to this idea of economic fairness, I think somewhat unfounded.
I get it that there are differences of opinion about what the optimal strategy is. I guess the problem with the big business bribery issue is it's just not clear where it stops. You know, if Nike gets a tax subsidy, why shouldn't Intel get a tax subsidy? If they get if they get a subsidy this year, what do they get 5 years from now? It's, you know, in terms of economic theory, you look at bargaining power. Who has bargaining power? Who has the power to walk away? Are you better off buying them off in the short run, or are you better off realigning your commitments in the long run? In my view, the fact that you're losing more and more Fortune 500 corporations should tell you something about the existing strategy not working. It's not succeeding. You know, we're not really able to use tax incentives to prevent large firms from seeking the highest rate of return and the lowest profits. They're increasingly able to relocate overseas. And so I guess it's a strategic question, and opinions are always going to differ about what the optimal strategy is. But again, I think the existing strategy is not working.
Thank you for your talk today, Professor. I'm Judith Huck, new City Club member and local small business owner. You mentioned small businesses mobilizing to create benefit for the local businesses. Do you have ideas on how that would be done, or an example of a community that had success in the small business mobilizing?
I don't actually have a lot of great success stories to tell in that area, but in my own community of Western Massachusetts, I've seen the worker-owned businesses pool, basically tax themselves and pool a percentage share of their profits into a venture capital fund to promote the development of other worker-owned businesses in the area. And I think that's a really interesting and really promising model. I think there are probably, I would be surprised if there weren't members of the Portland small business community, including some people here today, who have some ideas about what's been happening here and what else could happen. And I think they're probably better qualified to give really specific advice about it than I am.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm Harriet Cook from PSU Sustainability. And I have a question. You mentioned the importance of creating greater efficiency. And I've been reading and studying the work of Bernard Lietaer, who's the economist who's recently written the book Rethinking Money. And he shares all kinds of stories about successful transformations through the use of complementary currencies. And as one of his foundational principles, he talks about sustainable systems, whether they're environmental systems or social systems, that balance efficiency with resiliency, and that resiliency depends on interconnectivity and diversity. And our current financial system is one kind of a monetary system that requires a growing and expanding economy on a finite planet. And I was wondering if you have done much work with these ideas or studied some of these successful uses of complementary currency systems. They do have a historical precedence and times when they were very successful in Europe and anyhow.
Thank you. I don't know the particular thinker that you're describing. I find efforts to develop alternative currencies really interesting. I guess I'm not among those who think that they are a panacea. It's kind of to me, it always sounds like sort of a progressive version of monetarism, like the problem is all in money and the money supply. If we just change the way that we handle money, everything will work out fine. I think the problem is more difficult than that, and I think it's more rooted in production. You know, whether we can organize a system of production that is really efficient in the larger sense, that makes the best possible use of our financial capital, it makes the best possible use of our human capital, our social capital, and our environmental capital. And I think the project of doing that is going to require more than a change in our currency alone.
We have time for one more brief question.
Thank you. Peter Hayes, City Club member. I'm wondering whether you feel there's a relationship between the rise of locally based economics, such as you've discussed, in society's evolution toward having reduced tolerance for and acceptance of traditional externalities such as degraded natural capital and human capital in rural places?
Yes. And I don't think it's like decreased tolerance for externalities. It's that the externalities are mounting. It's easy to ignore externalities when they're small. The polar ice caps are not small. It's easy to tolerate a level of unemployment at 4%. 7.8% unemployment, that's a big externality. That's a lot of waste of human talent and energy and motivation. So what's happening, I think what's driving this is that and I think this is going to continue to happen, that we're seeing these costs that were easy to ignore are just mounting and mounting and mounting. I believe they're going to continue to mount, and that's why the sooner we think about how to improve our management of them, the better off we'll be.
We have run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week when Tom Hughes joins us to discuss the state of the region. As we close for today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to Professor Nancy Folbre. We are adjourned.